Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Boys of Dunbar, a story of love, hope, and basketball, by Alejandro Danois, narrated by Mirron Willis. I like to hear of wealth and gold, and Eldorados in their glory. I like for silks and satins bold to sweep and rustle through a story. The nightingale is sweet of song. The rare exotic smells divinely. And knightly men who stride along the role heroic carry finely. But then, upon the other hand, our minds have got a way of running to things that aren't quite so grand, which, maybe, we are best in shunning. For some of us still like to see the poor man in his dwelling narrow, the hollyhock, the bumblebee, the meadowlark, and chirping sparrow. We like the man who soars and sings with high and lofty inspiration, but he who sings of common things shall always share our admiration. Common Things by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Prologue. Like brothers. The seeds of this book took root on the playgrounds of Brooklyn, New York in the early 1980s. A hoops fanatic, I spent countless mornings, afternoons, and evenings playing against my friends in the tilting, fenced-in concrete courts of the East New York, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Starrett City, Clinton Hill, and Fort Greene neighborhoods. The steel rims were bent at oblique angles, slowly succumbing to years of violent dunks. The withered paint identifying the half-court, free-throw, and out-of-bounds lines have been rubbed raw by generations of abuse at the heels of rubber-soled sneakers. In the frigid, early winter mornings, when exhaling created a mirage of cotton clumps floating out of our mouths, my buddies and I shoveled the snow, ice, and slush that layered the courts to get a game going. On oppressively humid nights, we scattered from our apartments, like roaches at the flick of a light switch, into drenching downpours. The suction created by the wet elements allowed us to palm our favorite orange basketball, bald from years of fights against the unforgiving blacktop. We stacked nickels earned from returning empty soda cans and purchased sets of tight netting, woven together in the patriotic ensemble of red, white, and blue. The nets dangled from the rims, like diamonds from the earlobes of a stunning woman. Cosmetics aside, the true reward was the sweeter-than-Kool-Aid sound of a perfect jump shot rippling through the twine before spinning back toward earth. Invariably, the nets would vanish in a day or two. I imitated the ball-handling wizardry that was coded into the DNA of New York City point guards, and dedicated many a solitary session to honing a jump shot that I was sure would lead me to Madison Square Garden and a lucrative contract with my New York Knicks. On a few occasions, I shared the court behind my apartment building with my neighbor, a teenage man-child who was lustily pursued by the slick recruiters representing this country's premier institutions of higher basketball. He was a star at Brooklyn Technical High School, all city, and on a direct flight out of the neighborhood, climbing onward and upward toward a shot at the NBA. I would rebound his missed shots, staring with reverence at his sparkling white Chuck Taylor Converse sneakers. I wondered if, one day, I, too, would be blessed with the same massive musculature that he packed onto his 6'8" frame. In 1983, that neighbor, Lorenzo Charles, would go on to author the most famous ending in NCAA Finals history. He rescued an air ball propelled from a teammate's 30-foot desperation heave that had no discernible hope of touching rim. Somewhere between the Rio Grande and Sandia Mountains in the game's waning moments, the ball floated down through the dry, hot, thin air of the pit in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and landed softly in his outspread mitts. At the apex of his jump, Charles delivered a relatively bland two-handed dunk at the final buzzer that allowed coach Jim Valvano's North Carolina State Wolfpack to defeat Clyde Drexler, Hakeem Olajuwon, and the heavily favored University of Houston Cougars by a score of 54-52 to capture the NCAA title. It was one of the biggest upsets in the history of sports. The frantic scene of pandemonium at the conclusion of the 1983 championship game is the NCAA's tournament's signature moment, the visual definition and affirmation of the multi-billion-dollar bonanza known as March Madness. The image of Valvano sprinting across the court, his tie flailing like Clark Kent's en route to a phone booth, his face blended into a cocktail of ecstasy, terror, shock, and deranged joy, has been a staple of CBS's television coverage, like syrup on pancakes, ever since. My buddies and I passed many a day in the park, not only playing, but dissecting and debating any and everything hoops related. One day we went through the pantheon of legendary names produced on our home turf. The playground legends like the Destroyer, the Goat, Jumpin' Jackie Jackson, the Helicopter, Pee Wee Kirkland, and Fly Williams. Acclaimed pros such as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Lenny Wilkins, and Bob Cousy, Connie Hawkins, and Tiny Archibald. We followed the timeline up to our current favorites Julius, Dr. J. Irving, Bernard and Albert King, Sidney Green, Sam Worthen, and Vinnie the Microwave Johnson. We marveled at the teenagers we watched in high school and summer tournaments, or heard about in the tales of urban legend, like Dwayne the Pearl Washington, Lloyd Sweet Pea Daniels, Richie the Animal Adams, John Spider Sally, Ed Davender, Bruce Dalrymple, Rod Strickland, the Coney Island Marbury brothers, Eric, Donnie Jr., and Norman, whose younger brother, Stefan, would go on to surpass them all, Chris Mullen, Mark Jackson, Walter Berry, and Ed Pinkney, who we were certain would one day add to the legacy. A man in his young 20s, a neighbor with incredible talent, whom we'd watched and cheered for in neighborhood hoops tournaments, resplendent in a burgundy silk sweatsuit, gold medallion, and those funky-looking new sneakers called Nikes, listened intently, adding his own 2 cents on occasion. As he stood up, stretching a lithe 6'4" frame, he looked at me with one raised eyebrow and said something I'll never forget. Yeah, New York is the king of basketball, but the best team I ever saw is from Baltimore, he said. Dunbar. The dudes on the bench are going Division I on scholarship. They've got the #1 high school player in the country named Reggie Williams, but the funny thing is, he's not even the best player on his own team. Their best player is the point guard, a little dude about 5 feet tall, a midget named Bugsy. We laughed at that last statement, thinking he was joking. Yeah, right, a midget point guard named Bugsy. And he better than the top player in the country? Okay. We giggled and shrugged. Shortly thereafter, I was attending a prestigious boarding school in Massachusetts on a scholarship for talented minority students from the inner city. Initially homesick, I took solace in one facet from home, the one universal language spoken everywhere. I surrounded myself with it, insulating myself from a profound cultural shockwave. It carried me through 5 painstaking hours of study every night. I wasn't in Brooklyn anymore, but I still had basketball. I quickly acclimated myself to Boston's subway system, the T, and frequented the gyms at Harvard, Boston College, Northeastern, as well as the famed Boston Garden. Thanks to a classmate whose father had access to season tickets, I sat 8 rows behind the Celtics bench. It was an incredible upgrade from my beloved nosebleeds in Madison Square Garden. I witnessed Red Auerbach light that damn victory cigar more times than I care to recount. I became enraptured by the steamy, decrepit structure that shook to its core as Larry Bird's soft jump shots splashed through the nets. I saw a frail-looking, wiry kid named Reggie Lewis at Northeastern University annihilate the college competition and admired his skill and fearlessness. When I learned that he didn't start for his high school squad back in Baltimore, I wanted to find out about that team. Sure enough, he played for the Dunbar crew that I'd heard about in one of my playground debates back in Brooklyn. I stayed glued to the new cable channel with the innovative idea of 24-hour sports programming, ESPN, to the consternation of my prep school classmates. And when I saw an incredible 5-foot 3-point guard at Wake Forest named Muggsy Bogues, a one-man fast break and defensive press, the likes of which had never been seen before, I damn near fell out of my chair. "That's Bugsy!" I screamed at the television in my dormitory's common room the first time I made the connection to the miniature point guard from Baltimore whom my neighbor had told me about. "Yo, that's Bugsy!" The dorm mates, who did not seem to share my enthusiasm, looked at me with shreds of pity and amusement. I watched giddily as Muggsy assumed the role of David to the ACC's Goliaths. I observed Gary Graham and Keith James playing for the University of Nevada at Las Vegas in the 1987 Final Four, and saw David Wingate and Reggie Williams win the 1985 National Championship at the apogee of Georgetown University's reign atop college basketball. I followed the progression of the Dunbar Poet teammates, an astounding 4 of them who played pro ball, reading the box scores after every game. And I wondered about what their lives were like as kids. The relationships they had with one another, the individual and family struggles they overcame, what growing up in Baltimore was like. What happened to those who didn't make the pros, the ones who didn't play ball after college, and the ones who had their last hurrah as adolescents in high school. This book, about the 1981-1982 Dunbar Poets, among the greatest high school basketball teams of all time, is a reminder of what the game was and what it needs to become again. The 81-82 Poets, with a plethora of top NCAA prospects and an astounding 4 team members who would go on to play in the NBA, grew up in a different time and place. It was a time when the head coach, Bob Wade, knew the players since they were kids, had grown up with their relatives, and was feared in a loving, paternal sense, not only by his players and former players, but also by the criminal element that engulfed the struggling East Baltimore community. The 1981-1982 Dunbar Poets had all the prerequisites of a great team. A great team is led by a great teacher and coach on the sidelines and pushed by some alpha dog among them, whose personal example inspires and elevates those around him. Such a team has strong leadership from top to bottom. Pat Riley was one of the best coaches in NBA history, but it was Magic Johnson's leadership that stirred his Lakers teammates to play at a level that they would not have without his presence. An outstanding team is much more than a collection of talented players. A great team shares the ball openly and willingly, and each member feels invested in the team's success. Every player must understand his role and perform it to the best of his ability. The team must work in unison. A dominant team has a diverse set of weapons, enabling it to excel in a fast-paced, up-and-down game, or in one that is a grinding series of slow half-court offensive sets. It excels offensively and can suffocate an opponent on defense. The players might not always get along, but they respect one another as teammates. They can communicate, oftentimes without speaking, simply by observing one another's expression or body language. They have an emotional intelligence on top of their athleticism and technical prowess that allows them to compensate for one another when needed. The Boys of Dunbar had these qualities. Many of them had known one another since they were toddlers. They'd played together on the same milk crates when they were too small to reach a 10-foot rim. They'd eaten at dinner tables with one another before they showed the potential to earn a college scholarship or have a shot at the pros. Their coach knew their families before they were even born. In a true sense of the word, they were a family. The Dunbar players did not worry about how many shots they took or who grabbed the most rebounds. They believed in the family dynamic that Coach Wade taught. They knew that their skills were valued within the family and that those skills would lead to playing for a great college program and a free college education. The mounds of recruiting mail, along with all of the celebrated and eminent college coaches like North Carolina's Dean Smith, Louisville's Denny Crum, Georgetown's John Thompson, and Maryland's Lefty Driesell, made their way to Coach Wade's office as the initial and most important point of contact in the early 1980s. The parents awaited Wade's approval before any school could make its recruiting pitch in the players' living room. As an educator who had played professional football and knew all too well the brutal nature of college and pro sports, Wade's priority was what was best for his players, not how much he could squeeze from Nike, Reebok, Adidas, and Pro-Keds, or the coaches and wealthy boosters from the nation's college hoops factories. The players, many of whom could have been the featured superstar at another school, loved one another like brothers, bonded by their neighborhood ties and desire to add to the Dunbar legacy. They played for the name on the front of the jersey, not their individual names on the back. During the off-seasons, they played together in local Baltimore tournaments called Project Survival or the BNBL, Baltimore Neighborhood Basketball League, events that held great meaning and prestige for them. They were not splintered off, traveling the country on competing AAU teams, fighting one another for prime recruiting positions or rankings. The only national ranking that mattered to them was the #1 ranking that Dunbar would eventually attain as the best high school team in the country. When you examine the embarrassment of riches that Coach Bob Wade had at his disposal, on top of all of those important elements that great teams have, the level of talent that the Poets possessed is astounding. You can go position by position down to the last man on the bench, and you will find the perfect high school team. Reggie Williams was 6'7", the nation's top player, who could play guard, forward, and center. He could shoot, rebound, defend, and block shots. How good was he? A year after leaving Dunbar, during his freshman season in college, he was the most outstanding player in the NCAA National Championship game, helping to deliver the title to Georgetown University. David Wingate was one of the best defensive players ever. He played in the NBA for 15 years. Reggie Lewis did not even start for the Poets, and yet still went on to become the captain of the Boston Celtics. Gary Graham was a captain on UNLV's 1986 Final Four team. Tim Dawson was the Atlantic 10 Rookie of the Year at George Washington University before transferring to the University of Miami. And Muggsy Bogues was an extraordinary talent, the shortest player ever in the NBA, a one-man fast break and defensive press, who astounded everyone who watched him play, both in college and in the NBA. We'll see more Michael Jordans before we see another Muggsy Bogues. 10 members of the Poets teams from 1981 through 1983 played major college basketball. 4 of them made it to the NBA, and 3 of those were first-round draft picks. As young kids, they made a pact, promising one another to stay on the right path and avoid the pitfalls of their predecessors. In high school, they complemented one another perfectly. They raised the spirits of a struggling city, grabbing the city of Baltimore's heart like no other team has, before or since, came together to inspire others, and set the table for Sam Cassell, Carmelo Anthony, Will Barton, and others who springboarded out of Baltimore into the NBA. And most important, they loved one another like brothers. No recent high school player in Baltimore was more celebrated than former Patterson High School point guard Akil Carr, a 5'6", jet-quick, athletic marvel who was more popularly known by his nickname, the Crime Stopper, because city police noticed a sharp decline in activity on notorious drug corners whenever he played. Carr's father, Alan, grew up in East Baltimore competing against the players who would comprise the great Dunbar teams of the early 80s. One of Akil's role models is none other than Muggsy Bogues, who spoke with and counseled him on the pitfalls to avoid and the necessary skills to polish in order to succeed as a short player at the game's highest levels. For the city championship game between Patterson and City College high schools during Akil's sophomore season, the Hill Fieldhouse on the campus of Morgan State University was filled to capacity, with 500 fans stranded outside in sub-zero temperatures who could not gain admission. Carr, saddled with early foul trouble, sat on the bench for large portions of the first half. He erupted for 24 second-half points and led Patterson to a runaway 75-59 victory. He finished with 32 points, 8 assists, and 4 steals, with many of his spectacular plays causing pandemonium in the stands. Seated next to me watching that game was a woman in her 70s, Vivian Hockaday, who had also seen the majority of the games played by the 81-82 Dunbar Poets. When Akil dribbled and weaved through traffic like a human blur, delivering implausible passes that resulted in easy baskets for a teammate, eliciting ear-splitting roars from the crowd, Miss Hockaday shook her head and laughed. She looked over at me with dancing eyes, shielded by thick glasses, and tapped me on the arm as I feverishly wrote in my notepad. "We haven't seen anything like this since Muggsy," Hockaday said, nodding toward Akil Carr. "But can you imagine him playing with 4 other guys who were just as good as he was? That's what it was like with those Dunbar teams back then. We'll never see anything like that again. My God." Chapter 1. Yes, I Can. At the conclusion of the first varsity basketball practice for Baltimore's Paul Laurence Dunbar High School, the young men gathered in the gymnasium were exhausted. They all stood at attention, varying shades of brown faces, glistening with perspiration, staring at the bear of a man who'd alternated between screams of disgust and soft words of encouragement. They were the chosen ones, the few who had actually realized the dream this early in their lives. Through every summer tournament, winter recreation league game, and one-on-one contest, through every solitary morning, sidestepping broken glass and empty liquor bottles, dribbling a ball through imaginary defenders to practice jump shots or master the backboard, the boys' goal was the same. Not the NCAA, not the NBA, but suiting up for the only franchise that mattered to them, Dunbar. They yearned to hold aloft the flame of Dunbar basketball excellence. Whatever their drill sergeant of a coach demanded of them, they demanded of one another. The Dunbar tradition was a major source of pride to a large swath of the city of Baltimore. The fact was not lost on any of them. The imposing edifice of Dunbar High School was stuffed tightly amid dreary housing projects and sagging row homes in predominantly black East Baltimore. For all of the drab building's shortcomings, the gymnasium inside was a veritable shrine, a sacrosanct place to the young men now standing on its hardwood floor. Despite their weary muscles, the boys were anxious to get their season underway. For head coach Bob Wade, who was also Dunbar's head varsity football and baseball coach, and returning players like junior All-American Reggie Williams and highly recruited seniors David Wingate and Gary Graham, the disappointment of the previous season's 94-91 triple overtime loss to Calvert Hall, a Catholic school, remained fresh in their minds. It was a contest that many thought was one of the greatest high school games ever played between 2 Baltimore area schools. Despite the months that had passed and the fresh start that a new season promised, that loss inspired Dunbar from the first whistle of that initial practice. Wade was entering the season with a mind-boggling record of 132-10 as Dunbar's head coach, having won 5 Maryland Scholastic Association titles over the previous 6 years. But there were many people in the city who questioned his success and the tactics he employed to achieve such a sparkling resume. There were whispers from parents and coaches at other city schools intimating that Wade recruited his players. 3 of his team's new starters had transferred from other schools at the beginning of the 81-82 school year. Some people wanted an investigation and sanctions, referring to Dunbar as the City All-Stars. But the truth, as difficult as it was for some to accept, was that Wade did not need to recruit. Dunbar was the city's marquee public school program, with an astounding talent pool that resided in the surrounding housing projects. Almost every talented kid in the city wanted to play there. I never recruited a player. Nor did I have to, said Wade. Dunbar had a tradition of excellence that many kids dreamed of being a part of. That tradition was established long before I ever got there. I was just lucky enough that so many talented kids wanted to be a part of what we were doing. Wade may not have recruited players, but he certainly singled out those youngsters he believed showed the most promise, regardless of their neighborhood or school district. The Poets had lost 3 games the year before. Wade was more determined than ever that this new squad was going to do better. His challenge every year was to find which buttons to push with certain players, who could accept being yelled at, and who needed quiet encouragement. At various points in practice, he joked, he cajoled, and sometimes he yelled and insulted. One minute he'd appear surly, brusque, and dyspeptic. The next, solicitous and benevolent. With the talent at his disposal, he drove them mercilessly, determined to make practices so difficult that every game, no matter who they faced, would be a cakewalk. In his eyes, the 3 losses that they had suffered the year before were 3 too many. Wade emphasized the game's details, the subtle nuances that many high school kids never learned to master. His practices were filled with hours upon hours of drills that fostered a mastery of things like defensive footwork, swift defensive rotations designed to keep players between the opposing man and the basket, how to take charges, how to set screens, the proper angles to take when rolling off the screen and cutting to the basket, how to box out for rebounds, and how to throw outlet passes, among a plethora of other details that could be the difference between a win or a loss in a close game. Wade ran the same drills over and over again, programming his players to react quickly and correctly to various game situations. The casual fans who packed Dunbar's gym and didn't have an advanced understanding of the game undoubtedly enjoyed the frenetic pace that the Poets played at, the alley-oops, the slam dunks, and the way they ran the ball down an opponent's throat. They might have assumed that his players were just great athletes, and that all Wade had to do was roll the ball out and let them run up and down the court. But sophisticated students of the game could see the discipline, how fundamentally sound and unselfish his Dunbar teams were, how they'd coalesced as a unit, always seeming to make the right plays by instantaneously adjusting. Wade's other obsession was academics. From the mandatory study halls that were required for his players year-round, even when their sport was out of season, to the teachers he convinced to give up a slice of their free time to volunteer as tutors, Wade's commitment to his athletes' classroom responsibilities was unquestioned. If a star player needed help, Wade had a support infrastructure in place. He'd make sure his kids worked in the classroom because he knew that one day the balls would stop bouncing. If a star player failed, there were no special provisions or demands on teachers to let his boys slide by for the sake of athletic victories. If they couldn't handle their responsibilities in school, they simply couldn't play for him. Wade also had another mechanism in place that allowed him to keep tabs on his players outside of the school: the neighborhood grapevine. He'd walked the same streets during his youth, knew the neighborhood inside and out, and had a network of informants, from law enforcement personnel like his good friend Marshall Goodwin, who worked as an officer with the city's sheriff's department and served as the team's de facto bodyguard, to folks involved in the less desirable elements of the underground economy. Having grown up in the area, he was well respected, even by the criminal element.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?